While Ainz had started casting magic the moment they had met, Zannac did not seem to be on guard at all. It appeared as though he did not have any intention to assassinate Ainz. Afterwards, Ainz took out 2 cups and an ice-filled container from his inventory. How about some water? Alcohol would be inappropriate given our current situation, so what about orange juice instead? Thank you very much, Your Majesty. Just water would be fine. Now then, we are all set for the talk. What should we discuss then? Perhaps about the justification of our invasion. That would not be necessary, Your Majesty. I am more interested in the reason why you were insistent on carrying out such heinous acts. Why did you refuse our offer to surrender? That was a natural question for him to ask. Although to Ainz, his reasons were clear and justified, to them it must have appeared to be senseless slaughter. Ainz nodded his head. Given how things had turned out, there was no point in hiding his intentions anymore. He began to exposit the Sorceress Kingdom's plans to Zannac. Because we stood to gain nothing from that. I intend to sacrifice your people as an example to the world of what would happen to them if they stood against the Sorceress Kingdom. To that end, you will all be eradicated, and the kingdom will be rendered into a mountain of ash. That mountain will continue to serve as a warning after centuries, after millennia, of how foolish of an act it would be to go against the Sorceress Kingdom. You do not appear to be jesting. Of course not, I am just stating what is to come. Why? What do you mean? Ainz could not read between Zannac's lines, and thus replied with a question. Your Majesty, the Sorcerer King is in possession of immense amounts of power. Even if you did not do what you said you would, the people of the world would still come to know your awesome power. Zannac wetted his lips, swallowed a mouthful of saliva, and asked, Why are you this petty? Petty, am I? Zannac tensed up at the possibility that he had angered Ainz, but Ainz was not angry at all. What is your goal? Ainz grumbled to himself, what is your goal? In the past, to Ainz, no, to Satoru, to have met the buddies he had in the game of Yggdrasil, was the epitome of his entire life. It was such a wonderful memory that all he wished for was to be reunited with his friends again. When the plug was about to be pulled from the game, when all of this was meant to be for naught, he was transported to this world instead. The end turned out not to be the end at all, but instead, it was a new beginning. The NPCs created by his friends began to exhibit free will. From their every move he could feel the remnants of his former companions. No, to be honest, the shock he had experienced at the beginning confused him so much that he was constantly worried about their betrayal. Looking back, that was moronic of him. Nowadays, he just did not question their loyalty at all. Yet, it did not seem like Ainz was the only one who was transported to this world. He could see the footprints left behind by other players. Perhaps it was only natural then for him to think that his companions, the people who shared those good times with him, could have come to this world as well. It was only natural for him to wish for this. Of course, Ainz knew that he was transported here during the final moments of the game's operation, which made his friend's appearance in this world unlikely. Actually, through the use of multiple spells and intel sources, he could faintly sense the lack of their presence. However, since he did not have concrete proof of that belief, the possibility of it happening still remained. One might call him an idiot for holding on to such vain hopes, one might also call him a feudal loser too. But to the Ainz of yesteryear, that was all his life had amounted to. And now that dream was gradually fading away. Sure, his friends were important to him, but now, the NPCs were important to him too. They were essentially children that had been left behind by his companions. Ainz, as the only one to have stayed behind, had the duty to protect them at all costs. Because of this, Ainz was willing to sacrifice his all to ensure no harm ever came to the NPCs. In order to ensure that Zannac would never fall to outside forces, he had to prioritize the empowerment of the organization's every aspect. Shaltir was dominated by some unknown entity in the past. Though he had succeeded in regaining control over her, if things had turned out any worse back then, important intel on Zannac could have been made known to outsiders. Consequently, it could have led to the destruction of the guild. He could not allow something like that to ever happen again. What is my goal, you asked? I seek something that is difficult yet also easy to obtain. All I wish for is a single thing. That is, happiness. Happiness. Zannac repeatedly blinked in surprise. Ainz laughed a little in response. He did not find what he had said to be so outrageous. No matter if you're human or whatever, the pursuit of happiness is the ultimate goal, is it not? Ainz threw away his act and began to converse with Zannac, as if he was a close friend of his. And you would step over others' happiness to achieve your own. Isn't that obvious? If the happiness of those I hold dear could be guaranteed, those of others do not matter to me at all. If you could secure the happiness of your subjects by inflicting suffering on the citizenry of another country, what would you do? Would you say, abandon their happiness altogether? Those are the extremes. Zannac calmed down as the sentence trailed. He lowered his head and said, that was out of line of me. My apologies, Your Majesty. Ainz went back to his ruler persona. It is fine, there is no need to worry at all. Even with the intellect and power of your majesty the Sorcerer King, there are no other possible methods to guarantee happiness. Perhaps, but I could only say perhaps. If you had a guaranteed method to obtain happiness, what would be the better option? To seek a perhaps non-existent secondary method or sticking with what has been tried and true? The goddess of luck is bald at the back of her head after all, was that how the saying went? Zannac was absolutely incredulous. What a strange goddess. Sorry, I did not mean to belittle the goddess you believe in. Please do forgive me. Haha, I don't mind at all. That was not something I believed in, just a proverb I remembered. Very well then, that is the extent of it all. For the happiness of my subjects, I must sacrifice your people. This is the basis for this war, do you get it? I guess so. I do relate to your majesty's desire. The pursuit of the betterment of one's own country and a guarantee to one's own countrymen's happiness, that could be said to be the only responsibility of a ruler. If the destruction of our people guaranteed the people of the Sorcerer's Kingdom their happiness, I do understand why you did not accept our surrender. I suppose it couldn't be helped. Right. You get it. Now then, it is my turn for a question, but I don't really have one. Ainz looked around while he pondered. Ah, right. The armor you were wearing reminded me of it, so I'll ask about that sword. The sword that Gazastronov wielded, who's currently in possession of it? It is currently under the safekeeping of a man named Brain Ungloss. Brain Ungloss. Ah, that man. When he dueled Gazev, there was someone by that name between the two men who had witnessed said duel. However, given how long ago that was, he could barely remember his appearance. Although he planned to turn the capital into ashes, he still planned to recover a few items, one of which being Gaz's sword. That man, has he come here too? No, he has not, your majesty. He should still be in the capital. Is that so? Then you would not have any issue with what kind of magic I used to destroy you all, right? The one in charge of sieging the capital was Cocytus, so he would have to order him to watch out for the sword later. While I have no intention to forfeit in this battle, I would be eternally grateful if your majesty was to use magic that would inflict the least amount of suffering on my people. You do have a point. I understand. After all, pleasant conversations like this one are hard to come by. For you especially, I shall try my best to kill you as gently as I could. Thank you very much. Zannac had on him a brilliant smile to which Ainz could not help but feel amazed. This man's courage was quite sizable. If Ainz was in his shoes, would he have been able to do the same? I do not think so. As expected of someone of royal blood. This has been very educational. Zannac took the glass cup in front of him and downed the water in a single gulp, as if he was not worried about poisons at all. Delicious, your majesty. Say, I do hope you could answer one last question of mine. Was your majesty the one who killed my brother, or was it one of your majesty's subordinates? Your brother. Ainz tilted his head and after a short while, remembered the prince of the kingdom they had already disposed of. He could not recall his name, but did remember that it was super long. It was probably one of my subordinates. Is that true? So he was dead after all. I feel like a huge weight has been lifted from my shoulders. Your majesty, thank you for telling me. I suppose it is time for us to bid farewell. After saying that, Zannac began walking towards his horse. Ainz walked towards the Soul Leader after he had tidied up everything, only to find that Zannac was still waiting by his horse. Ainz questioned in his mind why he had not already gotten onto his horse, as he climbed onto the Soul Leader. Only after he had done so, did Zannac mount his horse. Between a prince and a king, it was easy to tell who held the higher status, so he had probably done so to avoid looking down on Ainz from his high horse. To Ainz, someone who had not studied equestrian etiquette, this was the proper protocol that the aristocracy should strive to follow. Zannac standing in his mind rose by a bit. Looks like studying the etiquette of the upper class has become mandatory. What is it at this point? Will the number of things I have to learn ever decrease? Your Highness. The noblemen all came out to welcome Zannac back. Almost every noble that had answered his call was there. No one halted his exit from the front, yet now it felt like he could not get back in if he tried. That meant that everybody was anticipating for good news, the best of which would be if the Sorcerer King had agreed to hand it. Zannac answered their question with a curt reply. I couldn't do it. His Majesty the Sorcerer King plans to kill us all. That was non-negotiable to him. What he found to be surprising was the fact that there were still nobles who turned pale at this news. Were they still hoping that everything would turn out fine even with the current situation? Zannac got off his horse and left those nobles, who were all biting down on their lower lip and were deep in contemplation, behind to walk towards his own tent. After he entered the tent, the Minister of Military Affairs welcomed him, only for a sarcastic smile to surface on his face. That does not look like good news. In other words, just as we had expected, but, well, one thing did surprise a bit. Really? Speaking of which, I have never met with the Sorcerer King. Just what kind of an evil monster was he? Zannac smiled. He was more human than I thought. The Minister of Military Affairs was shocked at this answer. His eyes were so wide that they almost formed into circles. Perhaps that was the first time Zannac had seen him make that expression. Zannac began recalling his time with the Sorcerer King. It was true that on the outside, he appeared to be a terrifying monster, one that exuded an oppressive aura. Zannac could not even fathom how high of a value the clothing he wore had. Yet, even so, his only priority, the reason behind all of his actions, was for the happiness of those he held dear. Isn't it the most common of desires? Honestly, that should not have been the reaction of an undead, the mortal enemy of the living. He was too human. He could not understand the exact level of consideration the Sorcerer King had placed on this matter to have arrived at this conclusion, but from that bit of conversation, he could sympathize with him a little. Haha, yes, indeed. Just like a normal human. Zannac shifted his gaze from the minister to the exterior of the tent. Before things had turned out this way, perhaps he could have thought up a better method to deal with this. But they were past the point of no return already. So, what is the status of the command hierarchy and battle preparations? Your Highness subordinates, those from the capital are ready to move out immediately. Distributing our men between the capital's residences proved to be effective. The speed of the landed nobles, however, leaves much to be desired. They are still debating on who should be vanguard. The Minister of Military Affairs ranted on without hiding his disdain.